So it's my pleasure to introduce a man who needs very little introduction tonight, Professor AbdouMaliq Simone. I'm standing in for Ashmi, who's very apologetic he can't be here. And I'm really delighted to say it's a family reason, A-level choices, that he can't be here, so entirely valid. As you know, AbdouMaliq is at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, and anyone lucky enough to be here last night would know that he practically embodies, in every way, genetically, personally, religious and ethnic diversity, and a remarkable personal trajectory in the family. So we're really looking forward to the second of these lectures. So I'll just hand straight over.
Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Before I start, I would like to thank two people in particular who have had really an impact on what I'm going to talk about tonight. And the first is, perhaps of anyone writing today, has been most influential in opening up new horizons for thinking about urban life, and who has been an abiding support for a long time, and that's Jennifer Robinson. And the second person I'd like to thank is my friend Anant Marangati from the Hyderabad Urban Lab, who hosted me in Hyderabad for 2 months this year, and whose generosity and wisdom very much is responsible for what I'm going to talk about in terms of Hyderabad. Okay. So to inhabit usually entails knowing something about the place in which the dwelling occurs. Certainly, urban residents today generally have plenty of knowledge about the ins and outs of the places they got to deal with. Every single location is overdetermined and sometimes overwhelmed by a surfeit of information. While floods of knowledge do not necessarily mean that people are better informed or capable of knowing what to do with the conditions they face, nevertheless, it can't be said that anyone is operating in the dark. But still, a kind of darkness prevails. Despite the array of feedback and ratings and interoperable data generated about almost every point on every map, urban residents in many cities increasingly don't know where they are. It's not a matter of geographical illiteracy or social confusion. Rather, the complexities of urban environments can make things seem excessively opaque. There's just too much going on, and just too much to know, and too many factors at work in order for residents to come up with a coherent working narrative about what it is that makes them either feel the way they do, or accounts for the situations that they confront. In this talk, then, I will focus on residents operating in the dark. And it's not that some secret is stashed away unavailable to their scrutiny. It's not that there are conspiracies behind the scenes that manipulate the decisions of residents, how they decide where to live, how to spend hard-earned cash, or how to organize daily life. Rather, it is the sheer panoply of heterogeneous actions, recursions and feedback loops that run up and down discernible scales that throws everyone off the tracks. How things get done entails a much more multiple and provisional set of tactical maneuvers, financing, and governance. While the inequities of power deepen and resources are even more skewed to the dispositions of the elite, urban areas generate increased volumes of noise. Even as developers, politicians, bankers, and mafias seek to consolidate larger volumes of assets, affordances, and territory, Turning up the volume here induces larger numbers of crashing failures, tricks that backfire, and deceptions that reveal inordinate stupidity. I want to explore in this talk some of the ways in which residents, most particularly in Jakarta and Hyderabad, India, deal with this darkness, this situation, where many countervailing realities all seem to be equally possible and appearing, where the accelerated, haphazard, and brazenly opportunistic expansions of built environments that seek to get far away from what a given city was before reaffirm and cultivate interiors of care, but people looking out for each other. If places are too all over the place to feel inhabitable, the same might be said for the inhabitants as well. Just as notions of the urban are being extended across multiple spatial and temporal formations, so too are the modes of divergent inhabitation no longer contained or cohered with the once predominant figure of the human as anthropos. For the bracketing of cities as the embodiment, performance, and culmination of urbanization processes, while maintaining the facade of distinctive jurisdictions, is subject to intensive porosities and fragmentations. Cities exhibit a protracted history as differentiation machines, yet they still seem obsessed with citing a proper name of their normative inhabitant, the human, as an entity prohibitive of being anything else than what it is. In other words, an inhabitant not potentially intertwined with various ecologies and life worlds as a facet, rather than as a central player. The city existed as the locus through which certain of its inhabitants could reflect on their being as a singular prerogative, untranslatable across other modalities of existence. It was the place that formed a we unrelated to anything but itself. Yet this we was inscribed as the node whose interests and aspirations were to be concretized through the expropriation and enclosure of critical metabolic relations. The capacity to reflect and manage the recursive intersections of materials, space, and bodies required gradation. For gradation would specify various levels of capacity and right. It would designate who was to be considered human or not as the means to capture the volume of labor sufficient to monumentalizing the human form as the living embodiment of property and freedom. The capacity of the human to operate according to the maximization of its position required a notion of free will, of the ability to act freely amongst otherwise constraining interdependencies. This freedom necessitated relegating certain bodies to the status of property capable of circulating only through the transactional circuits of economic exchange and valuation. Now, this don't mean that dispensing with the human is the necessary precondition to enable a more judicious rendering of urban life. Rather, it is possible to come up with a different sense of what universals might be. For example, the emancipation projects necessary to upend the dependency on subjected and subjectless persons in predominant reflections of the human might reiterate the importance of the notion of flesh. Here, flesh is that unruly particularizing that takes place within seemingly featureless mass, and the mass transformed into individuals and particularities that can't be legislated, cannot be rendered an object of law or of discourse. Flesh with its cruel histories, perhaps ironically, then points to a more viable human. Flesh is what Hortense Spillers would call the 0 degree of conceptualization. It is the flesh that is exemplified within the context of black subjection, where particular bodies are read and governed as outside the gradations of genealogies, functions, capacities, and degrees of humanness. But these are readings, as Alex Wahalia argues, which at the level of the body's fleshy substance are, by virtue of the very act of being read, both inconclusive and insufficient, no matter how damaging they may be to the objects of that reading. Flesh lures the reader and then blindsides her at the same time. Flesh exists to be read, but always the wrong way. It compels not the analytical gaze, but attending to, of a process of caring, not based on the definitiveness or the instrumentality of the object of care. At the end of the evening, I will think of this caring for as the constant practice of excessive acts, which I associate with the Islamic notion of the ummah. But first, I want to pursue this notion of flesh by returning to the old architectural notion of urban tissue, what Andy Merrifield calls, and I quote, the urban as fine-grained texturing, as a mosaic and fractal form that has some delicate content, some feel to it, something we can touch and manipulate in our own conceptual hands, think feelingly, as it were. End of quote. It is the materiality of encounter among things, materials, bodies, each articulated to each other in ways that exceed the capacity to map, measure, and account for their oscillating relationships. Tissue, as the push and pull of different practices of connection that simultaneously compete with and complement each other, not in consensus, but in cross-patterning of stitch and weave, turn-taking, and looking out for, that Toni Morrison attributes to quilting gatherings of women in her novel, Home. Survival means covering the angles, hedging all the different ways that can be disrupted and changed. Urban tissue becomes increasingly flickering in the dark, pulsations here and there without regular pattern, as ways of life and built environments are ripped up, displaced, wasted. Cities continue to look outward, beyond their own peripheries to which inhabitants are increasingly pushed, look outward for their own possibilities beyond themselves, and as a result, themselves become this constant hunt for attention and money, and thus diminish paying attention to those who inhabit administrative territories to which these cities are responsible. Then the question is, what kinds of practices of looking out for endure? What are the affordances of care of people looking out for each other? I have long been interested in the processes of auto-construction as a means of thinking about the way inhabitation is made. Originally, auto-construction referred to a process whereby the urban working class and poor in the South build their own homes and local economic systems. But I use the notion of auto-construction not simply as the self-making of residents, but variegated repertoire of heterogeneous actions initiated by many different actors that exemplify a sense of partiality, of fragments available to work with, and which have no overarching map. More than shaping a material site, auto-construction is what Albert Corsine calls a process of rendering the city as method. It is about recursively creating infrastructures of circulation, feeling, mimesis, and assembling capable of not only mobilizing the city as is in different ways, but also to interrogate its apparent coherence and articulations of power. States may have allotted land or initial housing to peripheral residents, but these residents did not stand still in a process of always becoming something else. Auto-construction was about how to construct the conditions for continuous making, a mechanism of addressing a future itself remade in the action undertaken to address it. Auto-construction was about people infiltrating the city to do something else than simply reside, to find ways for the city to act on them so they might act on the city in ways seemingly untenable and unsustainable in present terms, but which nevertheless endure, even as places, bodies, and aspirations may not. Endurance is not the trajectory of specific entities, nor is it evidence of the prolongation of inhabitation. Rather, endurance is something that aligns time, that points to the folding of the future into what is done now, of experiencing the future in the now. The question today is whether auto-construction remains an ongoing process of any kind of urban development. It seems unlikely that process of residents making urban space in any other form, even in the most provisional desperate situations, is availed any opportunity whatsoever. As residents of all backgrounds and varied rights to the city are herded into increasingly formatted and completed modes of inhabitation, thus curtailing the trajectories of incremental adjustments, auto-construction seems relegated to the continuous revisions of the interior lives and behaviors of residents themselves. That's where self-construction literally becomes self-reconstruction, self-remaking, self-remaking within the sort of interior of one's personality and one's capacities, rather than something that is done in the external world. On the other hand, tropes that center around making things, notions of construction, development, degenerative, and productive, may only divert us from paying attention to the ways in which things may indeed operate in some kind of concert, of the work of silent ensembles of limited visibility. That is the kind of language we use to associate with auto-construction, the things about making, about producing, may themselves no longer function as vibrant words that really capture the way in which a sense of auto-construction prolongs itself within the contemporary context. That is, these words become a kind of ruse rather than a pointing to of these kinds of processes. As Elizabeth Povinelli points out, late liberalism invests in the continuing illusion of the autonomy of objects, the contestations of defined positions, and the possibilities of plural becoming. All of these are purportedly open to a wide range of possible futures, and particularly the possibility that an autonomous individuated self can, through will and skill, determine the course of particular futures. But the possibility is grounded on relegating, this possibility is grounded on relegating all of that which is not oriented towards such individuation to a past that no longer has anything to say. This past then is forcibly subjected to conditions that curtail its powers of proposition and render it, if indeed continues in some form of recognition, as the truth of the past, something frozen in particular self-contained and completed manifestations, incapable of being anything else than what they are and always have been. So Povinelli goes on to insist, the illusions of our epoch are the autonomous and the antagonistic. Other illusions may be better suited. Viruses, gassing, toxins. These are the names we give to manners of appearing and spreading, tactics of diverting the energies of arrangements of existence in order to extend themselves, strategies of coping, duplicating, and lying dormant, even as they continually adjust to experiment and test their circumstances, maneuvers to confuse and level every difference that emerges between regions while carefully taking advantage of the minutest aspects of their differentiation. So the manners of appearing and extending, what we might have called auto-construction in the past, take on different modes of visibility and collective enactment. Even here, I use the notion of collective not as a coherent entity, but as something more diffracted and superpositional, as a means of deploying a force, of folding in discernible individual lives and things into spaces of operation that are not inhabitable in a strict sense. In other words, the equation that links inhabitation to the hosting of something definable and that lends definition to that. In other words, the equation that links inhabitation to the hosting of something definable and that lends definition to that which inhabits, situating it in a complex ecology of interdependency and sustainable life, is upended in an urban mathematics that simultaneously situates residents in entangled multiplicities of constraint and potential, as well as thick webs of alternating governing and arbitrariness. There's, in some ways, the return to urban tissue, the return to this notion of urban tissue as some kind of flesh, a flesh that is not easily definable, not easily governed, not easily subject to a kind of analytical gaze, is in some ways a kind of maneuver, which within cities which no longer that if Povinelli is right, that in some ways the notion of antagonism and autonomy are the sort of illusions of late liberalism. That is, if antagonism no longer means antagonism, if autonomy doesn't really mean autonomy any longer, then are there, what kinds of modes, what kinds of formats, what kinds of modalities can embody the terms of some kind of different way of living with the urban and living with the city. So that's in some way the point of this notion of urban tissue. Urban tissue is a kind of elongation of the notion of flesh. It's in some way to think of these kinds of entanglements and to think about how people live with them in ways that don't appear to be always obviously those of resistance or alternatives, but somehow still embody a sense of trying to live with and act on the city in different ways. So urban tissue is then something compressed, a compression of many different realities and potentials. So taking a cue from Alexander Galloway, compression is about asymmetric encounters, where things operate in the same space, but which have no obviously discernible relationship with each other. Rather, the ground on which they are encountered and encounter each other embodies a generic orientation, a ground that has no particular definition. It is a ground where things can show up in various formats without contradiction, that does not need to be realized empirically according to specific criteria, but yet which engenders a sense of being in concert, of people being in concert, of caring and being with each other. Compression is a mode of appearance that need not constantly announce itself and its network positions. It is a mode of appearance that circumvents the imperative that everything has to be related to everything else. As such, compression is not the simultaneously folding in of the powerful or the weak. It is neither one thing nor another, but rather what Galloway talks about as a withdrawal from distinction. It is a kind of darkness. So that concomitantly then, a certain sense of ambivalence prevails in the ways that some urban residents consider their situations and prospects. Without the distance of perspective, it is not clear how they should exactly anticipate or plan. What is it that they think is really possible or viable? That which is familiar, which is relied upon, insists then upon showing up in strange ways. So it's not as if any sense of kind of anchorage is gone. Anchorage is still there, but one relies upon it not within the familiar terms, but in its sort of strange appearances. And so I'm going to now turn to talking about a specific situation in order to try to illustrate what I mean by this. And this is then this thing doesn't really do anything. Okay. So, part 2, deriving Jakarta, the complex tissue of the generic brand. Between now and 2021, 750,000 units of new so-called affordable housing are scheduled to appear across Jakarta. This would seem to indicate the consolidation of vertical living as the predominant form of residential life. But what does this mean? First, the development of such mega complexes proceeds largely in a process of hit and run. Often the land on which the complex is built has been acquired through temporary use rights. Units are usually sold prior to construction and often on a speculative basis, whereby units are resold before the project is completed to avoid property taxes, and where the subsequent buyers are often brokers who then parcel out these properties through various subcontracting arrangements. There are often many ambiguities in terms of what constitutes the unit of property or the definition of the acquired asset. Residents are often informed after the fact that property titles cannot be issued until all of the intended units of the project, such as those still waiting to be built, are sold, given the often opaque legal arrangements between the developer and the owner of the land. Sometimes acquisition of an apartment unit does not include guaranteed access to the provision of water and electricity. What ensues is that in some of these complexes, given the plurality of leasing arrangements, entitling and service contracts, residents are paying a different price each month for what are otherwise absolutely equivalent units. As the bulk of units on offer measure from 36 to 40 square meters, the physical space does not correspond to the size of most of the households that end up acquiring them. In other words, the prevailing imaginary presumes that occupants to be an aspirant young middle-class couple with one or two small children who will eventually proceed to move on somewhere else. But as these types of units are rapidly becoming the new norm, it is difficult to see where that somewhere else is actually going to be and what it's actually going to consist of. As mortgage systems are limited in Jakarta, acquisition itself entails a broad mobilization of finance. This includes reciprocal borrowing arrangements among families and affiliates, profits from collectively generated economic activities, savings groups, the diversion and laundering of illicitly obtained money, advances on rental agreements from other properties, property swaps, or amenity packages for employees. The plurality of finance applied to the acquisition of units also translates into the heterogeneity of the residential composition. Sometimes residents related through various neighborhood, institutional, or work connections will acquire entire floors in these buildings. While most units are While most buildings are prefabricated, limiting the physical adjustments that can be made, floors are indeed remade within these constraints in order to accommodate extended families. What often ensues is the agglomeration of social differences that not only mirror the composition of majority districts, but also at times exceed them in the pluralities of household compositions at work. That is, there was a certain kind of political argument made in Jakarta that somehow when you move people from horizontal to vertical situations, you're tearing apart a very heterogeneous fabric and you're producing a much more homogeneous social composition. But in many instances, just the opposite occurred. That is, you have a greater heterogeneity within the vertical situation than you did actually within the sort of block-by-block neighborhoods. What often ensues is the agglomeration of social differences that not only, but given that the new environments are not contingent upon residents working out a wide range of both everyday residential and economic activities with each other, an atmosphere of anonymity still prevails, reinforced by the sheer numbers of residents involved. Yet at the same time, this does not necessarily lessen opportunities for residents to pay attention to each other, to take note of each other, and to work out the allocation of mixed spaces and the recalibration of floors and buildings to accommodate specific clusters of interests and identities. So consider the example of Kalibata City in central Jakarta, a seemingly standard outlay of 18 high-rise towers, 3,000 units, accommodating a population of nearly 30,000 people. On the surface, there's almost nothing to distinguish this housing complex from the hundreds of other so-called affordable developments strewn across Southeast Asia. Unlike many other similar developments, however, there has been some effort in landscaping ground levels with scores of small shops, restaurants, coffee houses, and public spaces, all of which provide opportunities for both residents and outsiders to attain a sense of just how heterogeneous the makeup of the complex actually is, for them to actually witness and see that heterogeneity. Perhaps part of this heterogeneity can be attributed to Kalibata's central location and proximity to a major commuter train line, which, given Jakarta's massive traffic problems, is a key factor in the population's decision about where to locate themselves. People who live in the suburbs and drive to work usually spend 5 to 5.5 hours in their car every day. So even though the complex, Even though the complex is only 5 years old, with most of the units having been sold before completion, it is subject to scores of varying subcontracting arrangements and layering of use rights, multiple forms of ownership, and internal local governance systems. Kalibata compresses a wide range of financial mobilizations that draw upon individual and collective savings, speculation, extensive lateral borrowing networks, remuneration for work, favors, money in need of laundering, the pooled assets of many different kinds of associations and barter, where, for example, land in other locations is exchanged for apartments, and subsequently sometimes in exchange for jobs or for access to opportunities and equipment. So in this way, in some ways, when we tend to see, there was a discussion earlier today about whether or not housing is a particular kind of asset different from other kinds of consumables. Here you have the kind of conversion of housing into a kind of tradable asset that can be traded for jobs, the prospects of jobs, opportunities, networks. It becomes in some ways much more fungible than we're used to conceptualizing it. Kalibata constitutes a non-proprietary appearance of a place that enables actors to write themselves into whatever is happening. A place where different kinds of actors can recognize something of themselves whenever they look at it. Its residential base is perhaps most exemplary of the many that one can find in Jakarta, where people of different incomes, religious and sexual identifications, and age groups largely live without conflict in close proximity to each other, a disposition increasingly unlikely in other parts of the city. Even as particular kinds of identities may be consolidated within specific buildings, and progressively colonize blocks of floors. The ways in which the character of the public spaces across the complex change during the course of the day points to a proliferation of niches, differentiating intersections of all kinds. So we can have sort of one makeshift cafe, and at a particular time of day, it's an area where activists meet. Then after the activists are finished, the African migrants come and they watch football. And after the African migrants come watch football, then comes like middle-aged, older-aged women who can't sleep, and suffer insomnia, and they go into like long bridge games and card games into the middle of the night. And then the people who they leave, and the people have to get up early for work, and they want to have breakfast. So I mean, there's this sort of sense that there are niches, but these niches are shared and they take place in one venue. Yet all of this takes place without continuous forms of monitoring or intervention. In part, this is because the composition is no longer a collection of discernibly differentiated identities, but rather provisional formulations, where residents are more or less different things at different times, depending upon who they are dealing with, both inside and outside the complex. That is, this becomes a because no one really knows what this place is. No one really can map out in the end what is this place definitively. Therefore, the inhabitants don't feel encumbered with always having to announce who they are. They don't have to stake claims to a particular kind of definition of who they are. There can be a mode of appearing to each other which fluctuates according to the kind of situation that one finds oneself in. But this kind of attitude, this kind of positioning also makes it much more difficult then to come up with a definitive sense about what the place is. So this is sort of reciprocal creation of a kind of an ambiguity. An ambiguity where both the place and the residents are always trying to hedge each other in terms of thinking about, well, what's the most opportunistic way of enacting myself or this place at any given moment. So while such shaky characters can provoke intense volatility, as evidenced in the large number of inexplicable deaths and more diffuse strange occurrences that take place in Cultivate, they rarely leave any kind of aftershock, as residents are always readjusting themselves in relationship to each other. Take the situation of individual units in a large apartment block. They all have nominal owners, even in a situation where none of them possesses outright certification guaranteeing access to the unit in perpetuity. Given the ambiguities of ownership and the rapid deterioration of infrastructure, the normative objective is to squeeze as much money from these units as possible. As most owners do not live in the particular complex in which their unit is purchased, the use of the unit is then brokered by various agents. Agents who handle a varying number of apartments and eventually acquire a diverse portfolio of units to rent out according to all kinds of temporalities, from one day to multiple years, and according to all kinds of different contracts. So if you're a broker in this situation, you would want to acquire a portfolio, and you want to have a diversified portfolio. A diversified portfolio mostly characterized by the way in which you can broker these units. So obviously you can broker things a day at a time, and that's the most lucrative business. But it's also the most difficult to monitor. So it doesn't have the stability of renting out for 1 year. So brokers will make their portfolio as a kind of diversity of temporalities attached to a particular kind of unit. Now, these portfolios are managed in a way homologous to derivatives, where implicit understandings are drawn that enable brokers to acquire various units from each other at some time in the future, according to specific conditions that prevail at the time. That is, there's a kind of, it's not like derivatives where there's an actual signed contract, but there's an implicit contractual understanding about brokers that they can acquire units that each other possesses at some time in the future if certain kinds of conditions prevail. So for example, if someone managed to make the kind of connection with made a political connection through another broker, that if that happens, then an apartment that broker has will revert to the one who's organized those connections for that person. So there's a kind of back and forth of what that portfolio is in terms of each of the brokers. Now these conditions can range from the rate of deterioration of the unit, its renovation, its floor location, its going price, locational advantages in terms of access to amenities, degree of surveillance of illicit activities, availability to be used for various functions, the character of the social atmosphere of the building in which the unit is located, and the extent of owner supervision over the conditions of tenancy, to cite a few. So for example, it's not just the temporality of the rental, which is part of the portfolio, but that each unit has a particular atmosphere. There's one unit might be close to like where a lot of drug dealing is going on. And one might want to get access to that because it means that there's payoffs going on that hall. And I might want to increase my illicit holdings, whereas someone might have too many of them. So if something happened within one building, a deterioration going on, and then I need to get rid of it fast, I might swap it for someone who has some other kind of situation. So there's a kind of reading process that brokers do in terms of trying to manage their portfolios according to all different kinds of temporalities, but also atmospheric conditions. And the way in which that unit, the connotation of that unit in the larger scheme of things. Brokers may attempt to narrow down their holdings to more easily manage standards and similarities around the character, conditions, and temporalities of tenancy. Others may attempt to maximize the heterogeneity of such holdings. So, in other words, there are frequent trades and options, and even these implicit understandings, the right of a particular broker to acquire a particular unit at a future time, even these rights are being exchanged and optioned amongst brokers, or as often the case, converted into rights of access to other managerial opportunities. So, for example, who controls the parking? A broker may control the parking stop. I may want to get into that. So I may trade the opportunity to manage the parking for swapping it for a nicely located 20 floors. So, I mean, it's all these sort of optioning processes going on. These opportunities might include the right to provide services and extract fees from parking lots, markets, traffic intersections. That's another big one. Managing traffic at intersections is a huge amount of money every day. Just, with directing traffic from one area to another. Or even access to particular volumes of goods and delivery systems. There's a great deal of competition within Kalibata because anything can be delivered. You make one phone call and you have anything you can be delivered within a matter of at least an hour. So there's a lot of competition of who gets control of these kinds of delivery circuits. In other words, what begins as an asset, a unit in an apartment building, becomes obviated, in Roy Wagner's terms, into dispositions that exceed calculation. What starts out as a particular piece of fixed capital with an assigned yet changing measurable value is converted through brokerage into a series of intensities. These intensities have their form in the apartment unit, but then are dispersed and entrained to other rhythms of circulation and combination whose ultimate value can be calculated. Multiple apparatuses, logics, and practices observed in management thus all stand by each other in ways that do not necessarily intersect. It is always difficult for actors looking and speaking from particular positions and perspectives to garner any overarching story of how things work or don't work. This is the case even when they are not entrenched in a particular position. but circulate among them as Jakartans attempt to do day in and day out. In other words, there is no contradiction or collaboration for sure. There is no way to tell whether the vast array of makeshift, seemingly improvised regulatory practices are tolerated top-down, or whether interventions that percolate below seep their way as facts on the ground upward through apparent hierarchies of control. That is, the common phrase is that there's a kind of dictatorship of the developer. And in some ways there is a complete dictatorship of the developer. The police are not allowed into without the permission of the developer. Members of parliament cannot come in on official business without permission from the developer. But the management of the complex itself, the developer does almost nothing. So in some ways, the developer is completely dependent upon these kind of complex brokerage systems percolating from the ground in order for it to cohere at all. But who controls what and what controls whom is something almost completely impossible to tell within this context. It is almost impossible to tell, for example, how these networks of brokers acquire hundreds of units in a given complex, whether these brokers are working together, or whether the subsequent territories have distinct complexions in trades, from drug dealing to food delivery to prostitution, to the formation of Islamic associations, and to the consolidation of gay-friendly buildings. It's impossible to tell whether the culmination of planned deliberations on the part of gangs, parties, or associations, or rather the incessant pushing and pulling, slippages and openings on the part of groupings whose compositions are only momentarily stable. Whatever the case, each disposition is experienced as equally plausible. Each stands by each other in a simultaneous connection and disconnection, where the grounds of a relationship rest in their seemingly having nothing to do with each other, and concomitantly their relative autonomy contingent on the fact that each disposition exists. Although Kalibata clearly has a particular history of coming into existence, its subsequent proliferation of physical and managerial arrangements during the past 5 years raises questions about what is it? What it is? Is it subsidized housing? Is it the concretization of laundered money? Is it a new form of auto construction? Is it a consortium project of local developers? Is it even part of the jurisdiction of the local government in which it is situated? The answer to all of these questions is both yes and no. For examining the operations of the complex from different analytical starting points, from different combinations of informants, and from different archives and records of transactions, all point to the presence of each of these elements, but without providing a clear framework through which their proportionality, the degree to which these elements are at work in their relationship with each other, can be determined. Different kinds of money, different kinds of residence, managerial practices, material readjustments, forms of ownership and tenancy may indeed encounter each other, but in an overarching environment of indifference. It is difficult to work how they all impact upon each other, compressed as they are into a space where so many different things seem to be happening. As such, the integrity of any of the elements, their distinctiveness as objects for comparison or integration, become inoperable. This is not about the assemblage of a hybrid urbanization, but rather the continuous proliferation of non-subsumable details incapable of being made inoperable. Most of the residents that I talk to don't even know what to call the complex. Rarely is it seen as home or a base of operations. In fact, the word for home is disappearing in the everyday vernacular of residents of Jakarta. And you never hear the word home really mentioned at all in Kalibata. Rather, it's just the notion of place, something. Rather, it is most referred to as place. When asked how the complex works or does not work, even here specificity is limited, as most usually people will invoke the word sesuatu. This is something. It is something. We are something. And in this compression, this kind of generic brand, which would seem to be the kind of reduction of human life into a form of utter passivity. In some ways it is, but in some ways, of course, as I've been trying to say, it is not. It becomes a modality in which through many, many different things happen, but yet a modality in which it's very difficult to say, well, this is the right way, this is the antagonistic way, this is the alternative way. It is simply the profusion of details that can't be subsumed into any interoperable way. Which I think is quite important because we live in a time of absolute interoperability. It's about making data sets interoperable, it's making about everything that we are and every knowledge thing, that data that we give about ourselves, interoperable with something else. And in some ways, this is a kind of creation of a collective opacity through and behind which perhaps many different things are possible. And then I just want to jump to some things about Hyderabad. And the context for what I want to say about Hyderabad is this. That my friend Anand talks about Hyderabad as a city that is always looking out for itself. That is not only just looking outward, not like always looking beyond itself to try to find out what it is, but almost chasing its own tail. That is, it doesn't have an appreciation at all for what it is and what it's become. So it's always trying to find these kind of moments where it can like grab onto itself. It doesn't quite know. It doesn't quite have a kind of memory of its history. It's almost accelerating so fast and not paying attention to where it's come from that it sort of grabs any moment to hang on to in terms of what it is. So I want to quickly play with this notion of looking out for. Balakapur is a predominantly Muslim neighborhood in the Pagoda district of Hyderabad that once was the site of tanneries and now hosts roughly 1,100 plastic and metal scrap retrieval and processing operations. It is situated in a former industrial area, much of which has been converted into middle-class apartments, and these newer residents exert substantial pressure to have the economies of Balakapur shifted somewhere else. Negotiations around the terms of relocation have been going on for many years. Labor-intensive, high-polluting, small-scale industrial production crowded into a warren of narrow lanes does present a range of environmental problems, especially for the contamination of the local water supply. Available infrastructure is substantially overloaded, and while there is general agreement both inside the district and out concerning the need for relocation, the state's unilateral approach has made this difficult. The district largely operates on the basis of an amalgam of practices that can be viewed as looking out for. This is a practice that resists scaling and that it seeks to constantly reposition the district in terms of long-home complementarities among different supply chains and export markets. It takes things in and then passes them along, but never on fixed circuits of transmission. As one local broker put it, Balakapur is everywhere. But this doesn't mean that it can have access to it everywhere from any location. The district has long cultivated itself as a place through which things pass and where local actors circulate through each other's contacts and relationships to the larger city. Given that the state views relocation as a matter of determining the appropriate scale of Balakapur's local economies and residential patterns, the state just doesn't really grasp what it is attempting to relocate. This is a district that receives bulk waste material from demolition and construction sites, discarded materials of all kinds from a wide range of sources and circumstances. Businesses and their workers acquire these materials largely through networks of contacts across the region, and there is intense competition among local entrepreneurs for contacts and sourcing opportunities. Once acquired, there are outfits that simply sort through the materials, disassemble them when necessary, and pass them into supply chains that will further act on them. There are also many small fabrication workshops that specialize in specific forms of recuperation and retrofitting. Plastics processing is largely centered on old forms of grinding, and where the requisite skill remains the ability to discern the particular compositions of plastic acquired and then categorized accordingly. It is an economy that depends upon reciprocity, collaboration, dissimulation, manipulation, trust, and extortion in various quantities and formats. The district is peppered with small restaurants that serve as trading floors, where brokers sit throughout the day exchanging information and disinformation as to sources, prices, and the conditions of materials. A hyper-attentiveness prevails, which drives this practice of looking out for. Since every operation is inserted in multiple chains of contacts, supplies, influence, kinship networks, and downstream users, everyone must respond quickly and efficiently to opportunities. For the rapidity and crafting of turnover are essential to recycling operations that in general must compete with cheap formal industrial production. Thus, one important aspect of looking out for means taking care of the capacities of all to endure, even as individuals undercut each other day by day. So looking out for also means covering one's back, remaining attentive to the flow of impressions and information that is disseminated to throw one off guard. It means being attentive to the multiple potential uses of specific materials and how to fit them into a plurality of distribution streams. In other words, it means paying attention to how materials are to be engaged in a way that both maximizes their value but also minimizes the amount of labor and refurbishing entailed. It means learning about changes in the production process, how new processing technologies, almost always deployed elsewhere, impact on the revaluation, eligibility, and necessary formatting of materials. For example, as new forms of textile production change the kinds of filaments that are required, prior impediments on moving plastics along because of color differences no longer apply. As tanneries voluntarily shifted their operations to other areas, owners of the plots on which they were situated turned them over to the workers, who in turn subcontracted them to a different set of actors, who then developed a local retail market specializing in cheap children's clothing. This market attracted customers from near and afar. It draws upon local labor, such as women and children, who couldn't fit easily into other economic activities. As the state now demands the relocation of the market as well, the tannery workers, to whom the original owners leased the use of this land, collectively insist that relocation does not just involve the market itself, but provisions of accommodation for almost all of the small retailers and laborers who work for it. Each of the predominant sectors, scrap, metal, plastic, rawhide, and tannery, they all maintain different positions on the terms of relocation, as might be expected. Yet in these negotiations, actors from each sector refuse to agree to a specific plan unless all others do so as well, and thus maintain a single voice in relationship between the district and the larger political and administrative worlds in which they have to deal with. Where volume continues to be a critical consideration, in Bolapur, what is more important is how the district itself and all of its simultaneously competing and collaborating components are situated in the constant passing through and passing along of materials. The important thing is how to sustain the multiple ways in which the district can act as a gravitational force that pulls materials through it, through various means of acquisition, and also how these materials can then be rapidly dispersed and moved along. That is the notion of constituting a kind of force field, where in some ways individual bodies are subjected in these kinds of both collaborating and competing relationships to generate a force which attracts materials and then dispels them at the same time. As such, volume is then reparticularized and acted upon in order to multiply the number of users. It is about how to refuse volume and aggregation diminishes the multiplicity of potential users and the uses and users of acquired materials. Not surprisingly, in an area where contestations over the terms of its continued existence intensify, Bolakor has witnessed the entry of many different Islamic welfare associations trying to cultivate particular constituencies. Money remitted from residents who have over the years set up small businesses in the Gulf, rebuilt the historic Masjid Jamia as a major symbolic gesture in efforts to focus the deliberations concerning the future of Bolakor on Muslim values. But these are values that are constantly being struggled with in the performance of an economy that requires many bad practices. The local councillor elected to the Hyderabad Municipal Corporation is constantly barraged by groups of women, some clearly primed by different political organizations in the area, complaining about interminable problems with water supply and quality. A more secular-oriented political party, now competing for Muslim voters in an attempt to break the monopoly of the All-India Majlis al-Ittihad al-Muslimin on this constituency, points out long-term neglect of basic services and environmental issues. Local youth are being drawn into Salafist study groups to the dismay of an older generation. The tanneries had already been gone when a serious outbreak of E. coli infections hit the area in 2009, killing 19 people. This incident reinvigorated the state's long-simmering sentiment to rid the area of pollution, a barely couched reference to the area's largely Muslim population. At first, there seemed to be a clear narrative about how this E. coli incident took place. Daily workers in the tanneries had largely gone into other occupations or left Bolakor altogether, as new residents entered to fill low-level jobs in plastic and metal. A residual trade in rawhides, however, remained, where animal skins are cleaned and dried and then sent to the big tanneries in Chennai. But in general, leather work had been increasingly impractical given the timing involved in transforming skins into suitable leather and the increased Chinese domination of this sector. Yet there are numerous artisans that remain stuck with this trade, as well as the largely poor Hindu workers they employed, who then saw this health crisis as an opportunity to draw attention to their situation from larger Hindu associations. The Leather Workers Union remains a powerful association in this district, but it has little to do with leather. Rather, their administration of 2 large schools and several medical clinics. They requested assistance from the government to either help transition workers in the remaining rawhide trade into new employment, or if this sector was to be relocated elsewhere, to identify a site that facilitated the integration of the rawhide trade into other aspects of processing animals. The state responded by cutting off the electricity to the district in hopes that this put pressure on the emerging plastics sector, dependent upon electricity for their grinders, to get rid of rawhide traders. In response, and through the networks associated with their educational missions, the Leather Workers Union approached the widow of an ex-governor to appeal to the present one. Given that favors were owed, the woman expressed her commitment to supporting the residents of Bolakor, and electricity was then restored. The thing is that clearly a health crisis had occurred, and several community workers were assigned to take water samples. It seemed as if some of the gore still attached to animal skins was washed down drains and found its way as contaminant into the water supply. However, when curious research geologists took soil samples in the area, they found large amounts of trace heavy metals, which would seemingly make it improbable for E. coli to survive. So it remains unclear to this day just exactly what killed those 19 people. All of this simply obscures the fact that water and sewage infrastructure have been seriously deteriorating over the years and need to be completely reconstructed. The municipal corporation, however, is unwilling to provide anything more than palliative measures, again pushing the need for relocation on environmental grounds. Rather, the state is reluctant to make substantial investments unless the value now inherent in Bolapur's land could be more profitably unlocked. Several years ago, the municipal corporation gathered some 300 registered plastic scrap dealers to continue the negotiations. But an additional 300 unregistered scrap dealers also attended the meeting and requested relocation, having support of both the registered dealers and the leather workers' union. Eventually, the state lost interest in trying to work out a viable relocation deal. By 2012, lacking operational space, dealers started to extend their houses into the street as far as their consciences would permit. Some would extend their building by 2 meters, perhaps then a neighbor by 3. Collectively, they create a situation of near gridlock. They are stuck and can't go back, further overtaxing the severely depleted infrastructure, making circulation even more difficult and raising tensions about overcrowded conditions. But this tension incites demands for data from many quarters, whether it now comes from wealthy businessmen in Chennai with their big tanneries, and who still might own property in Bolapur, or from various state planning institutions, or from prospective external investors. Local entrepreneurs respond to the state's indifference to their demands about and participation in the relocation process by expanding their physical work plans in ways that require labor-intensive negotiations about governing access to incoming and outgoing materials and calibrating rights of way. All of this consumes energies and political dexterity for limiting improvements. These tensions and negotiations draw attention to local entrepreneurs in ways that they cannot completely control, but which they nevertheless have a hand in shaping. This is a district of fine-tuned balances, not overt collective organization. There are patronage systems that have to be refigured so many times that whatever clarity they provide in terms of who runs things or who is indebted to whom has long dissipated. No one can exert too much pressure on anyone else. Despite apparently sitting it out, awaiting suitable relocation deals, almost every trader is already a part of a mesh of sites elsewhere. For the incessant negotiations, the rumor mongering, the reciprocities, and the manipulations, evident in both the day-to-day running of the local trades and maneuvering the complex spatial arrangements that have ensued in the past 5 years, also generate a circuit of information and opportunities about what is taking place across the wide urban region. As this region expands, so do the sectors in which as this region expands, so do the very sectors with which Bolapur is involved. So in some ways, what I'm trying to point out here is that making things inside of Bolapur so incredibly complex and unmanageable has in some ways the function of enabling actors in Bolapur to spread their influence, to spread their stakes, to take positions within the larger region of Hyderabad in ways that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So there's something about the unmanageability of internal economic life that has the byproduct of enabling a kind of dispersion, a reappearance of Bolapur in many different kinds of areas of Hyderabad. So residents try to find ways to cultivate these elsewheres, to get a foot in the door, and to find opportunities to take control. Additionally, residents sit on large chunks of land that could be eventually agglomerated into shopping or fabrication complex if these parcels that they had access to eventually have access to good roads. Here too, the development of any concrete opportunity entails how one manages relationships with people who have many stakes. In many respects, residents of Bolapur have already been relocated, but at the same time refuse the collective visibility of all of these partial relocations in order to maintain the endurance of Bolapur that somehow exists beyond or aside scale. That is, the refusal of eviction is not a refusal of eviction from a particularly coherent place with its own integrity and borders. It's the refusal to be evicted from a machine which allows itself to be replicated in many different ways on the outside. That is, it can be, in some ways, it's not a kind of holding on to a particular territory. It's holding on to a particular kind of machinic process, which has historically allowed Bolakpur to announce itself in many different regions outside of itself. So it's the refusal to be evicted from a kind of process, which is a kind of deterritorializing process at the same time. Bolakpur is something that is already gone, but in its departure intensifies the power of what remains, not as leftovers, but as some force difficult to identify or contain. Yet there is a continuous ebb and flow of looking out for, where residents, workers, and business persons point their attention to something beyond the local conundrum that threatens to swallow them. They've set up a situation where every moment they threaten to be swallowed by the very complexity that they have orchestrated. That is, in constructing this kind of forceful machine, they've created something which can eventually risk its implosion on a day-to-day level. So there's nothing elegant about this. I mean, there's always something that has to be attended to day after day. It's very labor intensive. They, like the materials they work with, position themselves as part of multiple streams, chains of passing things along, as evidenced in the confidence they display about how it doesn't matter if their particular livelihood doesn't work out in its present form. Look at what happens to the tanneries. They remade themselves at a great distance from the economic niche in which they started. For they are capable of doing something else. They always point to the way in which their daily routines are always about the performance of something else besides. Something else right next to the task at hand. Something that also has to be paid attention to. This, for them, is their sense of the Ummah, of the larger Muslim community. Not as a specific place to inhabit, but something that goes beyond scale, that cannot be scaled, like darkness, never clearly growing, never clearly receding. Thank you.